She would pay for this lie with more than just her soul. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach, a constant companion in the silent, sprawling penthouse that felt more like a museum of wealth than a home. It was a deal born of desperation, a whisper in the dark that had been overheard by the one man who could turn it into a gilded cage. He was the city's shadow king, a titan of industry and whispered underworld dealings, and she was just as Maid, a ghost who polished his marble floors and ironed the sharp creases into his emotionless suits. This is the story of a desperate bargain, a fake love that threatens to become the most dangerous and most real thing in their lives. Stay until the end to discover if a heart built of ice can truly be melted by a love it was only meant to perform. Zola moved through the vast apartment with a practiced, silent grace, her presence a mere whisper against the cold gleam of glass and chrome. Every surface in Kong Jinwoo's penthouse reflected the Seoul skyline, a glittering tapestry of a world he commanded from this sterile perch 40 stories in the air. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the hum of the climate control and the soft swish of her dark blue uniform. It was a silence that pressed down, heavy and suffocating, a perfect mirror of the man who inhabited the space. Jinwoo was a creature of shadow and control. She had worked for him for 6 months and had never heard him raise his voice, never seen his stoic expression flicker with anything resembling joy or sorrow. He was granite, immovable and cold to the touch. Yet, she saw the loneliness etched into the corners of his eyes when he thought no one was watching, a profound isolation that all the money in the world couldn't fill. She understood loneliness. Hers was a different kind, a frantic, clawing thing born not of wealth but of its absence. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a vibration of doom. She knew it was her aunt. Slipping into the cavernous pantry, she answered, her voice a hushed prayer. The news was exactly what she feared. Her mother's hospital bills had increased, and her younger brother, David, would be kicked out of the university if his tuition wasn't paid by Friday. The familiar wave of panic, cold and nauseating, washed over her. She was their pillar, the one who had sacrificed her own dreams of opening a small bakery to send money home. But now, the pillar was crumbling. Leaning her head against a shelf of imported spices that cost more than her monthly rent, a single, hot tear traced a path down her cheek. The weight of it all, the endless, grinding pressure, finally broke the surface. "Oh, God," she whispered into the silent pantry, her voice cracking with a strain of unshed sobs. "What am I going to do? I need a boyfriend. A rich one. Just for a little while. Someone to help. Just for a moment." She squeezed her eyes shut, a foolish, childish wish escaping into the dark. It was the most vulnerable, most honest thought she'd had in months, and she thought she was utterly alone when she said it. She was wrong. From the darkened archway of the dining room, Jinwoo stood motionless, a column of shadow against the city lights. He had heard every desperate, trembling word. The click of his polished leather shoes on the marble floor was like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Zola's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat as he emerged from the shadows, his face an unreadable mask. In his presence, the sprawling penthouse seemed to shrink, the air growing thin and charged with a terrifying energy. She felt pinned by his gaze, a dark, penetrating stare that stripped away all her defenses and saw right into the frantic, desperate core of her. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She was fired. Of course, she was fired. Such a pathetic, opportunistic sentiment, uttered in the home of a man for whom money was a tool of power, not a solution to common desperation. She began to stammer, words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Mr. Kong, I am so sorry. I didn't know you were there. It was a moment of weakness. It will never happen again, I promise. Please, I need this job. Her apology dissolved into a choked sob she couldn't hold back. He simply watched her, his expression unchanging. He didn't lash out, didn't call security. He just waited until her frantic explanation withered into a terrified silence. Internally, his mind was a storm of cold calculation. His grandfather, the old patriarch of the Kong dynasty, had delivered an ultimatum just that morning. Secure a suitable partner before the annual family summit in 2 weeks, or have one chosen for him, a choice that would inevitably involve a merger with a rival family, a woman of cold ambition who would be a liability, not a partner. He needed stability, a performance. He needed someone who would be convincing but temporary, someone with no claim to his world. He looked at Zola, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the genuine fear in her wide, expressive eyes, the tremble of her hands clasped before her. This wasn't the cunning of a gold digger. It was the raw, unvarnished terror of a person at the absolute end of their rope. Her desperation, so inconvenient for her, had just become extraordinarily convenient for him. He took a step closer, his voice low and devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the chaos raging inside her. You need a rich boyfriend, it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a confirmation of what he'd heard. Zola could only nod, tears glistening on her lashes. He continued, his tone as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. And I require a fiancé for a family gathering, a temporary arrangement, a performance for a specific audience. Her mind struggled to keep up, the logic of his words failing to connect in the fog of her fear. He stopped directly in front of her, the sheer force of his presence overwhelming. I will solve your financial problems. All of them. Your mother's medical care, your brother's education. In return, you will play a role for me. You will be my devoted partner. He paused, letting the weight of the impossible offer settle in the space between them. I will be your boyfriend. The words hung in the air, a preposterous, dangerous lifeline. Zola stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was offering her a deal with the devil, a way out that led deeper into a world she couldn't possibly understand. It was a trap, a fantasy, a madness. But as she thought of her mother's tired face and her brother's hopeful eyes, she knew it was a madness she was about to embrace. The contract was as cold and impersonal as the man who'd had it drafted. It lay on the polished surface of his obsidian desk, a stack of pages filled with clauses and stipulations that governed every aspect of their manufactured reality. Zola's hand trembled as she signed her name, the ink a stark black signature sealing her fate. The moment the pen lifted, the air shifted. She was no longer Zola, the maid. She was a performer, and he was her director. The power dynamic, already skewed, had twisted into something new and infinitely more complex. Their first lesson began immediately. There was no time to waste. His family's summit loomed like a guillotine. We need a history, he stated, his voice clinical as he led her not to the kitchen or the laundry room, but to the plush leather sofa in his living area. It was the first time she had ever been permitted to sit there. The act felt like a transgression. He wanted to practice, to test their chemistry in a public setting where the stakes were low. He chose a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, a place where the waiters moved with silent efficiency and the clinking of cutlery was a hushed, reverent sound. Zola, dressed in a simple but elegant dress he'd had delivered, felt like an imposter. The fabric was silk, a material she had only ever touched while laundering his shirts. She clutched the small handbag, her knuckles white. The awkwardness between them was a tangible thing, a third guest at their table. He, a man who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals with brutal efficiency, was utterly lost in the art of small talk. She, a woman whose life was a whirlwind of work and worry, had forgotten how to simply be. So, she began, her voice a little too loud in the quiet room. How should we say we met? Jean Wu stared at a bread roll, as if it held the secrets to the universe. His mind, a fortress of strategy and logic, had no file for fabricating romance. He had always acquired what he wanted through power or payment. He had never needed to charm. At the opera, he said finally, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. Zola's eyes widened slightly. I've never been to the opera. I own the controlling stake in the Seoul Metropolitan Opera House, he replied flatly, as if that explained everything. It is a plausible venue for our social circles to intersect. His answer was so devoid of romance, so transactional, that a small, nervous laugh escaped her lips. The sound surprised them both. For a fleeting second, the tension broke. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the desperate woman from the pantry or the terrified employee, but a woman with a light in her eyes, a warmth that his sterile world desperately lacked. He noticed the way a strand of her dark hair curled beside her ear, the genuine amusement in her smile. An unfamiliar feeling stirred within him, something that wasn't part of the contract. He cleared his throat, the stoic mask slipping back into place, but the crack was there. We will say we met at a charity gala I hosted. More believable, Zola nodded, a real smile touching her lips this time. Okay, a gala. As the evening wore on, under the pretense of building their story, they spoke more than they had in her entire 6 months of employment. He learned her brother's name was David and that he was studying engineering. She learned he drank his coffee black and despised modern art. They were constructing a lie, brick by awkward brick, but beneath the fiction, a fragile, unplanned foundation of truth was beginning to form. The penthouse, once a symbol of his authority and her servitude, transformed into their rehearsal stage. The sterile, silent space became the backdrop for their strange apprenticeship in intimacy. They moved from public etiquette to the far more treacherous territory of personal history, spending hours after her official duties were done creating a shared past. The city lights glittered below, a silent audience to their nightly performances. During one such session, surrounded by architectural blueprints and financial reports on his coffee table, Zola strayed from the script. They had been inventing a story about a shared holiday, a ridiculous fiction about a trip to Jeju Island that felt hollow and false. She looked at him, truly looked at the man behind the carefully constructed armor, and asked a real question. What do you do when you're not this? She asked softly, gesturing vaguely at the imposing apartment, at the aura of power that clung to him like a shroud. The question hung in the air, simple yet profound. It caught him completely off guard. He paused, his gaze shifting to the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the vibrant, living city he possessed but never participated in. What did he do? The answer was a stark, echoing void. He worked. He strategized. He attended meetings where sharks in tailored suits circled each other. He ate alone. He slept alone. He had no hobbies, no pastimes, no friends who were not business associates or subordinates. The silence stretched, becoming a confession more eloquent than any words he could have offered. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of something he could only identify as shame. He, Kong Jinwoo, who had everything, had nothing. Unable to answer, he deflected, his voice a low rumble. And you? What did you dream of before this? He gestured towards her, encompassing her current reality of servitude and sacrifice. The question opened a door inside her that had been locked for a long time. A genuine, wistful smile touched her lips. She spoke of her childhood, of the small, cramped kitchen that was always filled with the warm, sweet scent of her mother's baking. She described her dream, not of wealth or power, but of a small, sunlit bakery with a blue door, a place where people would come for coffee and warm bread, a place filled with laughter and community. Her words painted a vibrant, sensory world of warmth, family, and simple joys, a world that was the complete antithesis of his own. As he listened, standing by the window, his reflection a ghostly figure superimposed over the sprawling city. He felt the stark emptiness of his own existence like a physical blow. Her dreams were not about acquiring things, but about creating connection. He commanded an empire of concrete and steel, but she spoke of an empire of warmth and flower. In that moment, the carefully constructed lines of their arrangement blurred. He was not just looking at his contractual fiancée. He was looking at a woman whose quiet strength and selfless heart held a richness he could never buy. A profound, unfamiliar longing echoed through the hollow chambers of his heart. The day of the Kong family summit was approaching with the inexorable dread of a final judgment. The pressure was mounting, and the final pieces of their elaborate performance had to be set. The most crucial element was her transformation. Zola, the quiet maid, had to become a woman who could stand beside Kong Jinwoo and not look out of place, a woman who could withstand the piercing scrutiny of his formidable grandfather. He hadn't told her the full truth about his family's business, but she could feel the danger humming beneath the surface of his life. One afternoon, the penthouse was filled not with the scent of cleaning supplies, but with the rustle of silk and the murmur of a high-fashion stylist and her assistants. Racks of designer gowns were wheeled in, a dazzling array of colors and fabrics that made Zola's head spin. She felt like a doll being dressed, an object being prepared for display. One by one, she tried on the dresses, each one a more expensive and beautiful costume than the last. Finally, the stylist chose a gown of deep sapphire silk that shimmered like a captured night sky. It clung to her curves, the elegant cut highlighting the graceful line of her neck and shoulders. When she stepped out of the bedroom, the assistants fell silent. Jinwoo was on the phone, his back to her, his voice clipped and authoritative as he finalized a business deal. Then he turned. The words died in his throat. The phone slipped slightly in his hand. For the first time since she had known him, Kong Jinwoo's mask of detached control shattered completely. His eyes, usually so guarded and cold, widened almost imperceptibly, tracing the silhouette of the woman before him, as if seeing her for the very first time. He saw not an employee, not a contractual partner, but a vision of breathtaking elegance and beauty. He ended his call abruptly, his gaze never leaving her. "There is one final thing," he said, his voice huskier than usual. "We may be expected to dance." He gestured to a small speaker, and a soft, classical melody filled the vast living room. "I will teach you." He moved toward her, and the space between them crackled with a new, terrifying energy. This was not part of the business transaction. This was something else entirely. He reached for her, his movements hesitant for once. He placed one hand on the small of her back, the warmth of his palm seeping through the cool silk of her dress. The touch was a bolt of lightning, a jolt that shot through Zola's entire body, making her gasp softly. He felt it too, a current that short-circuited the complex wiring of his brain, leaving only the stunning, overwhelming reality of her in his arms. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the slow, languid melody. All his calculated thoughts, all his strategies and defenses evaporated. There was only the scent of her perfume, the feel of the silk beneath his fingers, and the profound depth in her eyes. The dance was clumsy at first, a hesitant series of steps on unfamiliar ground. But then they found a rhythm. They moved together, the vast city skyline their witness, the line between performance and reality dissolving with every beat of the music. The pretense melted away, burned off by the heat of a connection that was entirely, dangerously real. The music faded, but they didn't stop. They stood in the center of the room, still holding each other, their faces inches apart. The only sound was the frantic, synchronized beat of their two hearts. His thumb brushed against her cheek, a whisper of a touch that sent a shiver through her entire being. The world outside the penthouse windows, with its millions of lights and hurried lives, ceased to exist. There was only the space of a breath between them, a space charged with unspoken questions and terrifying possibilities. Jean Wu's mind, a place usually filled with cold logic and calculated risks, was utterly silent. All he knew was the magnetic pull towards her, an instinct that bypassed reason and went straight for the heart he hadn't known was still beating. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips, and for a heart-stopping moment, Zola thought he was going to kiss her. The thought was both a prayer and a panic. But then, a flicker of his old self returned. He pulled back, the movement sharp and decisive, breaking the spell. The air rushed back into her lungs, cold and painful. "The car will be here at 7, he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing, a poor imitation of his usual detached tone. He turned away from her then, striding towards his office and closing the door behind him with a soft, final click, leaving Zola standing alone in the center of the vast room, her hand pressed against her racing heart. The sapphire dress felt less like a beautiful gown and more like a costume for a role she was no longer sure she could play without losing herself completely. The calm estate was not a home. It was a fortress of tradition nestled in the hills outside Seoul, a place where ancient pines stood like stoic sentinels guarding generations of secrets and immense power. As their car swept through the imposing gates, Zola felt a wave of inadequacy, so profound it was almost paralyzing. The women she saw gliding across the manicured lawns were like creatures from another species, draped in jewels and exuding an effortless, inherited confidence. Jean Wu must have sensed her fear. His hand, warm and firm, covered hers where it rested on the seat between them. "Stay close to me," he murmured, his voice a low anchor in the storm of her anxiety. "And do not let them see you are afraid." Inside, the air was thick with polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes and the quiet, brutal judgment of old money. All eyes turned to them as they entered, a wave of whispers following in their wake. But the most formidable gaze of all belonged to the old man seated at the head of a long, formal dining room. Chairman Kong, Jean Wu's grandfather. He was a patriarch from another era, his face a roadmap of hard-won battles, his eyes as sharp and discerning as a hawk's. He beckoned them forward, his gaze sweeping over Zola with an intensity that felt like a physical violation. "So," the chairman's voice was like stones grinding together. "This is the woman who has finally captured my grandson's attention." Zola's heart hammered, but she met his gaze, remembering Jean Wu's advice. She gave a small, respectful bow. "It is an honor to meet you, Chairman." Throughout the tense, multi-course dinner, she was peppered with questions about her family, her education, her interests. With Jean Wu providing quiet, supportive cues, she navigated the minefield, using the fabricated stories they had so painstakingly rehearsed. She spoke of her fictional art history degree, of charity auctions and summers in Europe, and to her own astonishment, they believed her. More than that, they seemed charmed by her quiet grace and deferential manner. She was the perfect, unassuming partner for the family's powerful heir. The true test came after dinner, in the grand, dimly lit garden. Jean Wu was pulled away by his uncles to discuss business, leaving Zola momentarily alone. It was then the chairman approached her, his presence silencing the crickets. "My grandson is a difficult man," he said, not unkindly. "He has built walls around himself so high I feared no one would ever be able to climb them. He seems different with you." Lighter, he looked at her then, his gaze softening for the first time. "What is it you see in him?" The question was real, not part of the test. It demanded a true answer. Zola looked across the garden to where Jean Wu stood, his silhouette stark and powerful against the ambient light. She thought of the loneliness in his eyes, the awkward way he'd tried to invent a romantic story, the surprising gentleness of his hand on her back when they danced. "I see a man who carries the weight of the world on his shoulders," she answered softly, her voice filled with an unplanned, genuine emotion. And I see a good man who deserves to have someone help him carry it at that moment. Jinwoo turned, his eyes finding hers across the expanse of the garden. A silent communication passed between them, an acknowledgement that transcended their contract. The chairman saw it too. He gave a slow, satisfied nod. Later, as they prepared to leave, the night air was cool and crisp. Jinwoo led her to a secluded part of the garden, near a stone bench overlooking the distant city lights. "You are incredible," he said, his voice filled with a raw admiration she had never heard before. The tension of the evening, the fear and the adrenaline, finally gave way to a powerful, overwhelming wave of emotion. The line between the lie and the truth had been erased. He stepped closer, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently stroking her skin. "Zola." He breathed her name like a prayer. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like a performance. It was a collision of desperation and longing, of loneliness and hope. It was hesitant at first, then deepened into something raw and hungry, a confession of everything they couldn't say. In the shadow of his ancestral home, under the silent watch of the stars, their fake love story culminated in a moment of undeniable, earth-shattering truth. The drive back to the city was a masterpiece of unspoken tension. The kiss had changed everything, shattering the carefully constructed artifice of their arrangement and leaving them exposed and vulnerable in its wake. The silence in the car was no longer the comfortable, professional quiet they had once known. It was a heavy, charged thing, thick with the memory of that moment in the garden. Each of them was lost in a private maelstrom of confusion. For Zola, the kiss had been a devastating revelation. It had confirmed the terrifying suspicion that had been growing within her for weeks. She was falling in love with him. Not the idea of him, not the wealthy benefactor, but the man himself, the lonely, awkward, surprisingly gentle man hiding behind the granite facade. This love was a hopeless, dangerous thing, a feeling that had no place in their contract. She was an employee, a temporary fixture, and her heart had foolishly forgotten its role. She stared out the window at the blurred city lights, her reflection a ghostly image of a woman caught in a gilded trap of her own making. For Jinwoo, the kiss was a seismic event that had shaken the very foundations of his controlled world. He had never acted on impulse, never been ruled by emotion. His life was a series of calculated moves, strategic alliances, and emotional firewalls. Yet, when he had looked at her in that garden, so poised and strong under his grandfather's scrutiny, a fierce, primal wave of pride and possessiveness had overwhelmed him. The kiss had not been a strategic move to solidify their story. It was an act of pure, unadulterated want. The feeling terrified him. It was a weakness, a vulnerability he could not afford. Control was his armor, and this woman, with her quiet strength and disarming sincerity, had found the chink in it. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning pale, his mind racing to rebuild the walls she had so effortlessly breached. When they arrived back at the penthouse, the spell was broken. The familiar, sterile environment served as a stark reminder of their reality. He was the boss, she was the maid. He walked her to the door of her modest room down the hall from the main suite, a distance that suddenly felt like a chasm. "You performed your role exceptionally well," he said, his voice once again cool and distant, the warmth from the garden completely extinguished. "The initial payment, as stipulated in the contract, has been transferred to your account." The words were like a slap in the face. He was reestablishing the boundary, reminding her of what she was, a paid actress. The kiss, that earth-shattering moment of connection, was being dismissed as part of the performance. Pain, sharp and piercing, lanced through her chest. She couldn't meet his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Kong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She slipped inside her room and closed the door, leaning against it as the tears she had held back all night finally began to fall. Outside, Jean Wu stood motionless in the hallway for a long moment, his hand clenched into a fist at his side. He had done the logical thing, the safe thing. He had reinforced the terms of their agreement to protect himself from the emotional chaos she inspired. Yet, as he walked away down the cold, empty hall, he had never felt more alone or more like a fool. The fortress around his heart had been rebuilt, but now, from the inside, it felt exactly like a prison. The days that followed were a quiet, refined form of torture. The contract had been fulfilled. The money was in her account, enough to settle her mother's bills, secure her brother's education, and even put a down payment on a small commercial space. She was free. Yet, Zola found herself unable to leave. She told herself it was a sense of duty, that she needed to work out a notice period, but the truth was far more complicated. Leaving the penthouse meant leaving him, and that felt like a physical amputation. She retreated back into her role as a maid, becoming more silent and invisible than ever before. She polished surfaces that were already gleaming and avoided the rooms he was in, the vast apartment becoming a chessboard where they moved in a dance of mutual avoidance. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the ghost of a kiss that both of them were desperately trying to forget. Jean Wu, for his part, threw himself back into his work with a renewed, almost manic intensity. He took meetings at all hours, his voice a cold, sharp instrument of command on conference calls that echoed through the silent apartment. He was the lonely titan once more, surrounded by wealth and power, yet achingly alone. But something had fundamentally changed. The silence of his home was no longer a peaceful refuge. It was a roaring void that amplified her absence. He would catch her scent, a faint trace of the simple, clean soap she used, and his concentration would shatter. He would find himself staring at the spot in the living room where they had danced, the memory of vivid, painful specter. The world he had so meticulously constructed felt gray and lifeless, without the color she had brought into it. He had gotten what he wanted. His family was satisfied, his position secure. But he had lost something infinitely more valuable in the process. The breaking point came a week after the summit. Zola had finally gathered the courage to resign. She had typed a formal letter, her hands trembling, and planned to leave it on his desk while he was out. She was packing the few belongings she kept in her room, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, when he came home unexpectedly early. He found her with a small suitcase on her bed, his photograph, a gift from his smiling grandfather, taken at the summit, clutched in her hand. He saw the unshed tears glistening in her eyes and the resignation on her face. The sight broke through his carefully constructed defenses like a battering ram. The thought of her walking out of his life, of this silence becoming permanent, was unbearable. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "The contract is over, Mr. Kong," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She refused to let it break. "I'm leaving. My mother is stable, and David's tuition is paid. I have everything I wanted." He took a step into the room, his towering frame filling the small space. "Do you?" he countered, his dark eyes searching hers, demanding the truth. "Do you have everything you wanted?" The question hung between them, a final, desperate plea. Looking at the raw vulnerability that had finally cracked through his stoic mask, Zola knew the answer. The money had solved her problems, but it hadn't made her happy. It couldn't fill the void that leaving him would create. In that moment of shared, painful honesty, they both understood that their business arrangement had failed spectacularly by becoming something real, and its termination felt less like a release and more like a sentence. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his presence overwhelming the small room. He gently took the suitcase from her hand and set it on the floor, his message clear. "You are not going anywhere." His hands came up to cup her face, just as they had in the garden, and this time there was no hesitation, only a desperate, consuming need. "Don't call me Mr. Kong," he said, his voice a low, ragged whisper. My name is Jinwoo. The use of his given name, a simple intimacy they had never shared, was more potent than any declaration. It was an offering, a dismantling of the wall of formality that had always stood between them. Zola's breath hitched, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. He wiped it away with his thumb, his touch infinitely gentle. I was a fool, he confessed, his eyes boring into hers, filled with a regret so profound it stole her breath. I built this life, this empire of glass and steel, and I thought it was enough. I thought control was the same as happiness. It's not. It's just empty. His confession was a torrent, the words tumbling out as if a dam had burst within him. These last few weeks, pretending with you, it was the most real thing I have felt in my entire life. The silence in this apartment is deafening when you're not here. I don't want the silence anymore, Zola. I want you. Every word was a blow to the armor around her own heart. This wasn't the powerful, unapproachable tycoon. This was a man laid bare, admitting his loneliness, admitting his need for her. It was everything she had secretly, hopelessly longed to hear. But the contract, she whispered, the last vestige of her defense. It was all a lie. The contract was a lie, he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. But this is not. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. I don't need a fake fiancé. I need you. I love you, Zola. Not as an employee, not as a partner in a deception, but as the woman who walked into my empty life and showed me what it means to feel something again. The words, I love you, hung in the air, beautiful and terrifying. All her doubts, all her fears about their different worlds and the impossible gap between them seemed to melt away in the face of his raw, unvarnished honesty. The love she had tried so hard to suppress rose up inside her, fierce and undeniable. I love you too, Jinwoo, she sobbed, the words a mixture of joy and relief. He kissed her then, a kiss that was not about performance or passion, but about promise. It was a kiss of homecoming, of two lonely souls finally finding their harbor. It was the end of the contract and the true, breathtaking beginning of their story. He held her tightly, as if he could absorb her into himself, unwilling to ever let her go. The grand, sterile penthouse no longer felt like a cage, but a sanctuary, finally, blessedly filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the climate control and everything to do with the two hearts that had finally found their rhythm together. 2 years later, the scent of fresh bread and brewing coffee filled the air, a warm, comforting cloud that spilled out onto the bustling Seoul street. The morning sun streamed through the large front window of a charming bakery, illuminating the words painted in elegant script on the glass. Zola's place, the door, a cheerful, welcoming shade of blue, opened and closed with a merry jingle, admitting a steady stream of customers. Behind the counter, her face glowing with a happiness that seemed to radiate from within, Zola placed a warm croissant into a bag for a customer, her smile genuine and easy. She wore a simple white apron dusted with flour over a comfortable dress, her hair tied back loosely. She looked nothing like the timid, uniformed maid who had once moved like a ghost through a silent penthouse, nor the terrified imposter in a sapphire gown. She looked like a woman who had found her purpose, a woman who was home. The bell on the blue door jingled again, and this time, the man who entered didn't come for the bread. Jinwoo, dressed not in a severe, corporate suit but in a soft cashmere sweater and casual trousers, smiled the moment he saw her. The harsh, guarded lines of his face had softened over the years, replaced by a warmth and contentment that had once seemed impossible. He no longer looked like a lonely titan, but simply like a man in love. He came around the counter and wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder and inhaling the sweet, flowery scent of her hair. "How's my favorite baker?" he murmured into her ear, his voice a low, affectionate rumble that still made her heart skip a beat. Busy, she laughed, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. These cinnamon rolls are a bigger hit than your last corporate merger, he chuckled, the sound rich and real. He had delegated much of the day-to-day running of his empire, discovering that true wealth wasn't in a stock portfolio, but in stolen moments like these. He had learned to trade boardrooms for bakeries, finding more satisfaction in the simple joy on her face than in any multi-million-dollar deal. Their life was a beautiful juxtaposition of their two worlds. They still lived in the penthouse, but it was no longer a sterile museum. It was filled with the scent of her baking, with books and music, with the laughter of their friends. They hosted small, intimate dinners instead of cold corporate events. His family, won over completely by Zola's genuine heart and the profound change she had wrought in him, had embraced her fully. The chairman was a regular at the bakery, claiming Zola's scones were the only thing that could make him smile before noon. As the lunch rush subsided, Jinwoo took her hand, his thumb stroking the simple gold band on her finger. "Do you remember that first night?" he asked softly, his eyes full of the memory. "In that awful restaurant, when we tried to invent a story?" Zola smiled. "You wanted us to have met at the opera. It was a terrible idea," he admitted, a grin spreading across his face. "Our real story is so much better." He looked around the sunlit bakery, at the dream she had built, a dream he had been proud to help her fund, not as a transaction, but as a gift of love. He looked at her, his wife, the selfless caretaker who had saved him from himself. Their beginning was a desperate bargain, a lie whispered in a moment of despair. But from that lie, they had built the most profound truth of all, that love isn't found in perfect circumstances, but is forged in the fires of shared vulnerability, and that sometimes the most unexpected decision, born of a whisper in the dark, can lead to a lifetime of light.